Sometimes the most terrifying monsters aren't from movies, they're real. In this video, we'll uncover 10 disturbing true crime cases so horrifying they inspired some of the scariest horror films of all time. From hidden killers to gruesome mysteries, these stories prove that truth is often stranger and scarier than fiction. Story 1. In the quiet town of Plainfield, Wisconsin, Ed Gein was a name whispered with unease long before the world would know the horrors tied to him. To neighbors, he was a lonely man with a peculiar fascination for death. What lurked behind the peeling walls of his isolated farmhouse, however, was something so unspeakable it would scar the town forever. The Skin Collector. It started with the snow-thick, heavy flakes falling like a shroud over the tiny Midwestern town. Plainfield's streets were empty that night, save for the glow of a few homes where families sat warm by their fires. But in the heart of the woods, at the edge of town, one house stood black and silent, its windows like dead eyes. Martha had been missing for 2 days. She was the third woman in a year to vanish without a trace. Her sister, Ruth, refused to let another day pass without action. Armed with nothing but a flashlight and sheer determination, she trudged through the snow toward the property everyone in town avoided, Ed Gein's farm. The rumors about him were wild, ridiculous, but something gnawed at Ruth, a feeling she couldn't shake. The closer she got, the quieter the world became. No wind, no crunch of snow beneath her boots, only her own breathing, sharp and loud. She reached the house, its wood warped with age and its roof sagging like a tired creature. The front door was ajar. "Hello?" she called, the word dissolving into the void. No answer. She stepped inside and the smell hit her. Sour, metallic, suffocating. The beam of her flashlight revealed a scene of utter chaos. Junk piled high, newspapers yellowed with age, jars filled with a dark, unidentifiable liquid. But it wasn't the mess that made her stomach churn, it was the shapes. At first, she thought they were mannequins. There, slumped in a rocking chair, was a figure with sagging, pale skin. Its face was grotesquely familiar. Ruth gasped, her flashlight shaking as she stepped closer. The realization hit her like a blow. It wasn't a mannequin. It was Martha, or what was left of her. Her face had been stretched and crudely stitched to another body, her eyes hollow and unseeing. Ruth stumbled back, her scream frozen in her throat. Behind her, a floorboard creaked. She spun around, the beam of her flashlight slicing through the dark, landing on Ed Gein himself. He stood there, his head cocked to one side, his face partially hidden beneath a mask of human skin. "You're not supposed to be here," he said, his voice soft, almost childlike. Ruth turned to run, but her foot caught on something heavy and fleshy. She looked down to see a pile of what could only be described as parts. Arms, legs, torsos, all grotesquely mismatched. She gagged and scrambled to her feet, bolting for the door. Ed didn't chase her. He just stood there, watching, his head tilting further as if amused by her terror. When Ruth finally burst into town, her words were incoherent, her face pale as death. By the time the authorities arrived at Gein's farm, he was sitting at the kitchen table, calmly eating a bowl of soup. The horrors they found that day defied reason. Human skin turned into lampshades, skulls fashioned into bowls, and a belt adorned with human nipples. In the center of it all sat Gein, smiling faintly, as if he were proud of his work. Ruth never recovered from what she saw, and Plainfield was never the same. Even after the farmhouse burned to the ground, the shadows of Ed Gein's monstrosities lingered, an enduring nightmare etched into the town's soul. Story 2. The sleepy Long Island community of Amityville was rocked to its core in 1974 when the DeFeo family was brutally murdered in their home. Ronald DeFeo Jr., the eldest son, confessed to the killings, but the story didn't end there. What followed was a chilling tale of lingering darkness that would inspire one of the most infamous horror stories of all time. The Amityville Murders. The screams woke Jimmy across the street. He rubbed his eyes, thinking it was a bad dream, but the sound of sirens cut through the cold November air. Peering out his window, he saw flashing red and blue lights illuminating the DeFeo house. It was a quiet neighborhood where nothing ever happened until that night. Inside the house, the scene was one of unimaginable horror. The bodies of the DeFeo family, father, mother, and 4 children lay in their beds, each shot execution style. There were no signs of struggle. No one had heard the gunshots. The eldest son, Ronald DeFeo Jr., stumbled into a nearby bar hours later, screaming they're all dead. Police arrived quickly, and it didn't take long for suspicion to fall on Ronald himself. His story changed repeatedly. First, he claimed it was a mob hit. Then he confessed he had methodically killed his entire family. When asked why, his answers were chillingly fragmented. He claimed he'd heard voices urging him to do it. The house, he said, was alive with something dark. Months later, the Lutz family moved into the house, eager for a fresh start. But the horrors didn't end with the murders. George Lutz began waking at 3:15 a.m., the exact time of the killings. But cold spots plagued the house even in the height of summer, and their daughter began speaking to an imaginary friend who she claimed was Jody, a demonic pig with glowing red eyes. One night, George awoke to a sound like marching boots. He crept down the hall, his heart pounding. As he reached the stairs, the temperature dropped, his breath visible in the air. He froze when he saw dark figures moving in the living room, their heads bent low, as if in prayer. When he flipped on the light, the room was empty. The family lasted only 28 days before fleeing the house, leaving everything behind. They claimed the malevolence in the home was too much to bear. To this day, skeptics argue the Lutz story was fabricated, but the murders were all too real. The house at 112 Ocean Avenue remains a macabre landmark, a haunting reminder of a night when the American dream turned into a nightmare. Story 3. In the barren landscapes of rural Australia, travelers are warned of the dangers of the outback. Miles of desolation make it the perfect hunting ground for predators. One such story inspired Wolf Creek, a chilling tale rooted in the real-life horrors of Ivan Milat, the backpacker killer. The backpacker killer. The sun beat mercilessly down on Lisa and her friends as they navigated the dusty roads outside Sydney. They were backpackers from Europe, full of wanderlust and eager to experience the untouched beauty of Australia. When their van broke down in the middle of nowhere, they laughed it off as part of the adventure. But as the hours dragged on and the desert heat grew unbearable, their spirits faltered. As night fell, headlights appeared in the distance. Relief washed over them when a friendly man in a wide-brimmed hat stepped out of his truck. Introducing himself as Mick, he offered to tow their van back to his property to repair it. Exhausted and grateful, they accepted. Mick's homestead was a ramshackle collection of sheds and machinery, surrounded by miles of nothingness. The travelers sat by a fire as Mick regaled them with tales of the outback. His smile was broad, his laughter infectious, but there was something unsettling in his gaze, something predatory. Later that night, Lisa woke to a sharp metallic clang. Disoriented, she realized her hands were bound. Her heart raced as she took in her surroundings, a filthy shed lined with tools that weren't for fixing cars but for inflicting pain. Her friends were nowhere in sight. Mick appeared in the doorway, his friendly demeanor gone, replaced by cold detachment. "You're not leaving," he said simply, as if it were a fact of nature. Lisa fought against her restraints as he approached, his shadow looming over her. She screamed until her throat was raw, but in the endless expanse of the outback, there was no one to hear her. What followed was a nightmare of cat and mouse as she managed to escape the shed, running barefoot across the harsh terrain. By dawn, Lisa found herself on a dirt road, bloodied and delirious. A passing trucker stopped, and she collapsed into his arms, sobbing. The authorities found no trace of her friends or Mick's property. It was as if he had vanished into the desert, leaving behind only whispers and dread. The story of Ivan Milat, who murdered at least 7 backpackers in the 1990s, would later come to light. But for Lisa, the horrors of the outback would forever be etched into her soul. While Wolf Creek dramatized the tale, the reality was far worse, a grim reminder that sometimes the kindness of strangers hides unspeakable evil. Story 4. The Hinterkaifeck farm, nestled in the Bavarian countryside, was home to a quiet family who kept to themselves. But in 1922, the discovery of their mutilated bodies sent shockwaves through Germany. The unsolved case, filled with eerie details and unanswered questions, inspired chilling tales like The Strangers. The Hinterkaifeck murders. The wind howled through the trees as Andreas Gruber stepped outside to check the barn. It was late March, and the air was heavy with the promise of spring, yet something felt off. Over the past few nights, Andreas had heard strange noises, footsteps in the attic, whispers on the wind. When he checked, he found no one. Yet fresh footprints in the snow led to the house from the forest and stopped abruptly. No one had entered or left. Inside, the family was uneasy. Victoria, Andreas's widowed daughter, clutched her two children close as the storm rattled the windows. The new maid, Maria, whispered about the unease she felt since arriving. The previous maid had quit abruptly, claiming the house was cursed. That night, the family never made it to bed. When neighbors arrived days later, concerned by the silence, they found the house eerily still. Smoke no longer curled from the chimney. The livestock, unfed but alive, wandered the barn. Inside the barn, the Gruber family and their maid lay in a blood-soaked heap. Each had been killed with a mattock, their skulls crushed. The youngest, 2-year-old Joseph, was found in his crib, his small form lifeless under a blanket. The scene was chilling in its precision. Whoever had killed them stayed afterward, feeding the animals and even lighting the stove. A meticulous killer, comfortable enough to live among his victims. Despite extensive investigations, no suspect was ever caught. Neighbors spoke of a ghostly figure seen lingering near the woods in the weeks before the murders. Some believed it was an itinerant worker with a grudge, others whispered of a family feud turned deadly. The truth remains buried, much like the Grubers themselves. The Hinterkaifeck murders became one of Germany's greatest unsolved mysteries, a story of isolation, paranoia, and an invisible evil that struck without warning. The haunting silence of the abandoned farm endures, a testament to the horror of never knowing who or what was watching. Story 5. John Wayne Gacy, known as the Killer Clown, was a man of many faces. To his suburban Chicago community, he was a jovial figure who dressed as Pogo the Clown for children's parties. But beneath the painted smile was a sadistic killer, whose crimes would inspire countless horror films and nightmares, including Clown House. The Killer Clown. It was a crisp autumn evening when Tommy's parents dropped him off at the birthday party down the street. The front yard was ablaze with balloons and laughter, but what caught his eye was the man in the clown suit. Pogo, he called himself, his oversized shoes squeaking as he waddled up to greet the kids. Tommy didn't like clowns, and something about Pogo's too wide smile made his stomach churn. Pogo's show was a hit. He juggled, twisted balloons into animals, and cracked jokes that had the parents laughing louder than the kids. But Tommy noticed something no one else seemed to: the way Pogo's eyes lingered too long on the older boys, his hand resting just a moment too long on their shoulders. As the night wound down, Pogo offered to show the birthday boy a magic trick in the basement. Tommy watched as the boy followed, Pogo's gloved hand gently guiding him. Minutes passed, then more. The party continued upstairs, oblivious to the silence below. Curiosity got the better of Tommy. He crept to the basement door, pushing it open just enough to see. What he glimpsed froze him in place. Pogo was no longer smiling. The boy was crying, bound to a chair as Pogo's jovial demeanor melted into something dark, sinister. Tommy backed away, heart pounding, but his movement caught Pogo's attention. The clown's head snapped up, and his painted grin returned. "I want to see the trick too, Tommy?" he called, his voice syrupy and menacing. Tommy ran, the sound of Pogo's laughter chasing him up the stairs. He burst into the living room, screaming, but the adults dismissed it as a prank. By the time anyone checked the basement, Pogo and the boy were gone. Years later, John Wayne Gacy's House of Horrors was uncovered. The bodies of 29 young men were found buried beneath his home, victims of his sadistic double life. The image of the killer clown remains one of the most chilling symbols of hidden evil, a reminder that sometimes the most terrifying monsters wear the brightest masks. Story 6. The Snowtown murders, also known as the Bodies in Barrels case, shocked Australia with its brutality. Between 1992 and 1999, a group of killers led by John Bunting tortured and murdered 12 victims in a grim campaign of manipulation and sadistic violence. The atrocities inspired the harrowing film Snowtown, but the reality was even darker. The Bodies in Barrels. When Claire moved to the small town of Snowtown, she welcomed the slower pace of life. The locals were friendly, the air was fresh, and the community close-knit. But there was one house she was told to avoid: the abandoned bank building on the outskirts of town. Whispers claimed it held something sinister, though no one dared to elaborate. One night, curiosity got the better of her. She and her friend Mark decided to explore the building, armed with nothing but flashlights and teenage bravado. The bank was cold and smelled of mildew, the darkness swallowing their hesitant steps. The air grew heavier as they ventured deeper into the basement, where rumors of strange activity swirled. Mark's flashlight caught on something, a large, rusted barrel sitting in the corner. It looked out of place in the otherwise barren room. As they approached, the smell hit them a sickly sweet, rotting stench that made Claire gag. Mark lifted the lid, his face illuminated in the weak light. He screamed, dropping the lid as he staggered back. "What is it?" Claire whispered, her voice trembling. But she didn't need an answer. The smell, the dark liquid oozing from the barrel's edge, it was unmistakable. Claire turned and ran, dragging Mark behind her, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the emptiness. They never looked back. Authorities later uncovered a gruesome truth. The barrels contained the remains of multiple victims, their bodies dismembered and stuffed into the containers. John Bunting and his accomplices had lured their victims with promises of safety, only to subject them to unimaginable cruelty. They used the bank as a storage site for their crimes, their actions fueled by prejudice, greed, and a twisted sense of righteousness. Snowtown would forever be stained by its association with the murders. The building still stands, a monument to unspeakable horrors that no amount of time can erase. Locals refuse to go near it, and those who do speak of a lingering presence, a heavy silence that feels like the weight of the victim's suffering, forever trapped in that dark, unholy place. Story 7. And 7. In the 1970s, Dennis Rader terrorized Wichita, Kansas, under the moniker BTK, Bind, Torture, Kill. His ability to blend seamlessly into his community while committing horrific murders made him one of the most chilling figures in true crime. His meticulous methods and psychological games inspired many fictional killers, including aspects of Wolf Creek and other films. The Pet Killer. Wichita in the early 70s was the kind of town where people left their doors unlocked and children played freely in the streets. But that trust was shattered the night the Otero family was found dead in their modest home. Joseph and Julie Otero, along with 2 of their children, were discovered bound and strangled. The crime scene was precise, almost clinical, with no sign of forced entry. Dennis Rader watched the news reports with satisfaction, knowing he had left no trace of himself. He reveled in the power, the control, and the anonymity. By day, he was a church leader, a father, and a compliance officer. By night, he became the Pet Killer, prowling neighborhoods and planning his next project. Rader's preferred method was stalking his victims for weeks, learning their routines and savoring the anticipation. When he finally struck, he did so with chilling calm. One victim, a young woman named Catherine, awoke in the middle of the night to find Rader standing over her bed. He held a gun but spoke in a low, almost soothing voice as he explained the rules: don't scream, don't fight, and this will be easier. But there was no ease. Rader bound Catherine's hands and feet with precision, his movements methodical. He relished the fear in her eyes, the way her breathing quickened as she realized there was no escape. When her lifeless body was found days later, it bore all the hallmarks of BTK's twisted signature: ropes meticulously tied, and deliberate signs of torture. What terrified Wichita most wasn't just the murders but Rader's letters to the media. He described his crimes in detail, taunting the police with their inability to catch him. He signed every letter TAC, a cruel abbreviation of his methods. The hunt for him stretched decades, with Rader seamlessly maintaining his facade as a model citizen. In 2005, his arrogance became his undoing. A floppy disk he sent to police was traced to his church computer, leading to his arrest. The man who once hid in plain sight, smiling at neighbors and attending barbecues, was finally unmasked as one of America's most calculating serial killers. The tech case left an indelible scar on Wichita, a grim reminder that evil can wear the face of the man next door. Even now, the thought of him lingers, a shadow that refuses to fade. Story 8. Ant. In 1999, the case of Catherine Knight shocked Australia and the world with its unimaginable brutality. A seemingly ordinary woman in a small New South Wales town, Knight's crime was so grotesque that it's often whispered as an inspiration for tales of culinary cannibalism, such as Sweeney Todd. But the truth of her actions needed no embellishment. The Butcher of Aberdeen. Aberdeen was the kind of quiet, unassuming town where everyone knew each other's business. Catherine Knight was no exception, a butcher by trade. Her temper was as sharp as her knives. Those who knew her whispered about her violent streak, but no one believed she was capable of true evil, until the night she turned her rage on John Price, her partner. John was a kind man, well-liked by friends and neighbors, but his relationship with Catherine was turbulent, riddled with fights that often turned physical. After one particularly explosive argument, John confided in a friend, "If I don't come to work tomorrow, she's done me in." The next morning, John's house stood eerily silent. When he didn't show up for work, his colleagues called the police. Officers arrived to find blood smeared on the front door. Breaking inside, they were greeted by a scene so grotesque that even seasoned investigators recoiled in horror. John Price's body was found in pieces. Catherine had stabbed him 37 times, meticulously skinning his body afterward in a display of chilling expertise. The skin had been hung on a meat hook in the living room, almost as if it were a grim trophy. But the horror didn't end there. On the stove, police discovered a pot simmering with vegetables and chunks of John's flesh. Plates had been set on the dining table, each adorned with place cards bearing the names of John's children. Catherine's intention was clear. She had planned to serve them their father. When officers found Catherine, she was lying calmly on a bed, having attempted suicide after her crime. She survived and was later sentenced to life in prison without parole, the first Australian woman to receive such a punishment. Aberdeen never recovered from the horror of that night. John Price's friends and family were left haunted by the crime, unable to comprehend the depths of Catherine's savagery. To this day, the town speaks of her in hushed tones, a name that brings shivers to all who hear it. For Catherine Knight was no fictional monster, she was the embodiment of true, unrelenting evil. Story 9. In the dense forests of Northern California, a killer's cryptic letters and an unrelenting spree of violence terrorized a region and baffled law enforcement. The Zodiac Killer, whose identity remains unknown to this day, was as much a master of psychological terror as he was a murderer. The mystery inspired the film Zodiac, but the true story is far more chilling. The Zodiac Killer. It was a warm July evening in 1969 when Darlene Ferrin and Mike Maggio parked at a secluded lover's lane in Vallejo. The air was still, and the stars were bright, a perfect night for quiet intimacy. But as they whispered in the dark, headlights appeared behind their car, cutting through the shadows. The driver, a man in dark clothing, approached with slow, deliberate steps. He shone a flashlight into their faces, blinding them momentarily. "Get out of the car," he ordered. Thinking it was a police officer, they complied, confused but cooperative. Before they could react, the man pulled out a gun. Without warning, he fired multiple shots, hitting both of them. Mike crumpled to the ground, bleeding but alive. Darlene, however, wasn't so fortunate. The man stood over her and fired again, ensuring she wouldn't survive. Then, without a word, he slipped back into his car and drove into the night. The following morning, the Vallejo Police Department received an anonymous call. The voice on the other end was calm, almost cheerful. "I want to report a double murder," the caller said before describing the exact location of the attack. He signed off with a chilling detail, "I also killed those kids last year." It was the first taunt in what would become a horrifying pattern. Over the next few years, the Zodiac Killer claimed responsibility for at least 5 murders, though he hinted at more. He sent cryptic letters to newspapers filled with riddles, threats, and ciphers that seemed to mock the police's inability to catch him. One cipher, cracked by an amateur couple, revealed a chilling message: "I like killing people because it is so much fun." The Zodiac's most infamous attack came months later at Lake Berryessa. Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard were enjoying a sunny afternoon near the water when a masked man approached, brandishing a gun and wearing an executioner's hood. He tied them up, carving his symbol, a circle with a cross, into Brian's car door before stabbing them repeatedly. Cecilia succumbed to her wounds, but Brian survived to recount the nightmare. Despite numerous suspects and years of investigation, the Zodiac Killer was never identified. His letters stopped abruptly, leaving a void of fear and unanswered questions. The shadow he cast still lingers over California, a grim reminder of the monster who reveled in his anonymity and the terror he inflicted. For the victims, there was no closure, only a chilling legacy of a killer who thrived on control, fear, and the eternal mystery of his identity. Story 10. In the German village of Eberswalde in the early 20th century, a series of unspeakable murders shocked the nation. Karl Denke, a respected landlord and devout church member, harbored a dark secret that only came to light by chance. His crimes inspired countless horror stories about seemingly harmless individuals hiding monstrous tendencies. The Cannibal of Eberswalde. The smell was what drew attention to Karl Denke's small home. It wasn't overpowering but sharp enough to make passers-by wrinkle their noses. Denke, a soft-spoken man in his 60s, was known as a pillar of the community, often helping vagrants and travelers with food and shelter. His neighbors thought him eccentric but harmless. One cold December evening in 1924, screams erupted from Denke's home. A young man, bloodied and frantic, stumbled out into the street, claiming Denke had attacked him with an axe. The local police, skeptical of the story, entered Denke's home to investigate. What they found turned their skepticism into horror. Hanging from meat hooks in Denke's kitchen were human body parts, carefully butchered and labeled. Jars filled with pickled flesh lined the shelves, alongside bones stripped clean and neatly stacked. Denke's meticulous records listed over 30 names his victims along with weights and dates, as if they were inventory. In his yard, they found shallow graves containing more remains, each one carefully processed. When questioned, Denke remained calm, almost smug. He explained that he had been helping the poor by turning their bodies into food to sell at local markets. Sausages and cured meats from his home had been a staple for years, consumed by neighbors who had no idea of their origins. The town of Eberswalde was plunged into a collective nightmare. Families who had purchased Denke's goods grappled with the horrifying possibility of unknowingly eating human flesh. Though Denke hanged himself in his cell before his trial, his crimes left an indelible scar on the community. Denke's home was destroyed by villagers, desperate to erase the memory of what had happened there. Yet, whispers of his dark deeds persisted. To this day, his name is synonymous with unspeakable horror, a reminder that evil often wears a mask of kindness, waiting for the right moment to reveal its true face.